Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Julia Gerlach, Executive Editor for No-Till Farmer, and welcome to today's No-Till Farmer webinar, Tips for Improving Nitrogen Efficiency, brought to you by Verdesian. We are fortunate today to have with us Mike Zwingman. Mike is the Director of Agronomy for the row crop division at Verdesian Life Sciences. And for today's webinar, Mike is going to talk about why nitrogen management is a dynamic system and needs to be treated like it. He'll explain why remaining flexible within your framework is the key to making good decisions, how to build a nutrient management system that makes sense for your operation, and how mastering multiple tools can help you optimize nitrogen applications. Before I turn things over to Mike, I just want to have there's a couple of housekeeping items I want to make you aware of. On your screen, there is a Q&A button, and that will allow you to submit questions at any time during the presentation. But FYI, we're going to just hold those until the end of the presentation, and then Mike will get those questions answered at the end of the session. And then if for any reason the webinar is disrupted or you're seemingly disconnected from the broadcast, just go back to the invitation email you received and rejoin the webinar through the link in that email. With that said, thanks again for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Mike Zwingman. Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Julie, good morning, everybody. So like Julie said, my name is Mike Zwingman. I am the Director of Agronomy for row crops for Verdesian Life Sciences. And today, it's jokingly being said that I wonder if nitrogen sits around all day and thinks so much about me as I do about it. Nitrogen efficiency is one of my passions. And so I'm really excited to be able to share some of my thoughts today. And really these are based on agronomic. These are based on sound agronomics. It's just things that I've kind of put together in my own mindset that work for me when I'm thinking about nitrogen. So I want you to take what makes sense for you in your operation and not think this is me saying it all has to be like this. One of the things I'll talk about is how there's no one solution for nitrogen management. So some of the things we're going to talk about today are really going to be the way I think about it when I'm thinking about making in-season decisions, or even starting with pre-planning all the way to harvest. How I go through this decision-making process on my own, and how that when I'm thinking about nitrogen management, how that dynamic system. I jokingly say that like when we're talking about other nutrients, we're either talking about physical properties or chemical properties when we talk about interaction and availability. With nitrogen, we're really kind of balancing a couple biological systems, the plant and the soil. And inside that biological system, you have all these chemical and physical and biological reactions going on that lead to that dynamic nature of that nitrogen management, right? Like it's not linear. It changes from like optimum yield and optimum nitrogen rate change from day to day, or at least week to week within a cropping system. So we're going to talk about how to look at that through a different prism and through a different lens. We're going to talk a little bit about the law of diminishing incremental yield. We're going to talk about how to make those in-season decisions, or some tips to making in-season decisions, some tips to pre-harvest observation, and then really post-harvest metrics and evaluation. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the OODA Loop. And the OODA Loop is something I stumbled across just in reading some books written by special warfare operations people, and really this goes back to the origination of the Top Gun Academy. So for those of you who are Top Gun fans, and this is really where this originated, and it's how special warfare operations teams and how pilots make decisions in a dynamic warfare system. And so when you apply that to other systems, it really starts to make sense. And really what the OODA Loop stands for is observe, orientate, decide, and act. And in those things, there's all these subsets that you need to look at, right? Like observation, or the observed portion, is just information gathering. is that information good, bad, missing, incomplete, or is it implied? Is it something that just everybody should know? We're dealing with unfolding circumstances. What is the condition of your crop? What is the condition of the weather? How do things look? What's the weather going to be for the next 4 to 6 weeks? Those things, and that leads to that uncertainty where you have to kind of trust your gut. Then you orientate those observations to your gut feeling or your personal experience, the previous systems you've used. But the most important thing in this orient phase is looking at what should be versus what is. When we set out for a yield goal, we set out with this original crop plan and everything's supposed to go right, that's what should be. What is what has happened. Like we're looking at V5 corn, what has happened in that 35, 40 days from the time you planted it to that day that has affected either stand consistency, vigor, root mass, all those things. And really, is the yield goal for that corn the same as the yield goal you had in mind to start with? And how do you kind of go about making those decisions? And then you have to make a decision, right? You just have to decide. And you decide based on the options you lay out for yourself in the previous step. And then you start to observe and orientate to that new decision. And remember, there's never going to be a perfect decision. You just choose your best option. And your actions are, you either maintain your original course, you either change that course, and every outcome becomes a new observation for the next time you go through the OODA loop. And the thing is, it's a loop. So you just continually go through it all the time throughout the season. Every time you want to make a decision, you run it through that OODA loop and make those decisions based on what you see, what you know, what you can and can't do, and then you do it. And then the other thing we want to talk about is the law of diminishing incremental yield. Much like the law of diminishing returns that we learned about it in economics, the law of diminishing incremental yield is basically the same thing. What it shows us is there's this optimum zone between the point of diminishing returns and the point of maximum yield. And every bushel of corn before that is more expensive than every bushel after is less expensive than every bushel after that. So you're getting more production out of here, and as you go through here, every additional pound of nitrogen gives us a little less yield. So you have to decide when in here you want to be. And this is really when we talk about metrics at the end of the season, this is where you want your metrics boundaries to be, is where you are the most profitable and the most productive, and you want to stay away from these negative returns, because every time we get over top of this, what's going to happen is now we have nitrogen that's being unused, and it's out there for potential loss, whether it's leaching, whether it's volatilization, whether it's denitrification, any one of those things. That's what happens when we're out here. So managing to this zone and understanding that you're never going to be the perfect number in this zone. So being somewhere plus or minus the optimum number at all times to an acceptable value is where you want to be. And know that also when we're talking about good conditions and increasing yields, we don't necessarily have to add as much nitrogen as we think to get there, because we also want to pull some of that nitrogen away from the soil. So we want to, and if we have good growing conditions, and a lot of part of the Corn Belt, we have good conditions for mineralization. So we want to lean into that efficiency just a little bit. So we might give half the pounds of nitrogen we think we need, and try to capture the rest from the soil. So now we're going to go into the planning phases and the decision-making phases. And really, it all starts to me with preseason planning. And really what I did here is, like, when I'm thinking about preseason planning or in-season decisions, I think about the information I need to make the right decision. And the tools or resources I'm going to use to get those. And now, not all these are applicable to every operation because of limitations or some other things, right? But like, if I can get this, if I can let this out, I can really kind of make the best plan I can, the most optimal plan I can. In my part of the world, I like to see multiple nitrogen applications, maybe up to 3 or 4 in some cases. There's some extreme cases where I want to see even more than that, maybe even 5 or 6. So planning through that and having the capacity to do that through like fertigation or other means is something not everybody has. But if I need it and I have the capacity to do it, I want to have the plan to get into there and use that. So the first thing I want to know is how much nitrogen is left over in the soil. So I'm going to take, at very least, 40-acre composite samples from 12, 24, and 36 inches. At maximum, I'm going to pull from a number of grids and try to pull as many samples as I can. In my mind, I want to manage this from a zone perspective, whether it be normalized yield zones or imagery created zones or soil based zones, however you want to look at that, and try to lump like spots in the field together and sample from those zones and get a better idea of what's going on out in the field and what's going on from a nitrogen standpoint. And that's going to be the basis of what I start putting into whatever algorithm you're comfortable with using. Like, I'm not here to tell you that any one algorithm that a land-grant university or your ag retailer or your agronomist has is better than the other one, because they're all based on experience and local knowledge and those things. So whatever algorithm you're comfortable with or equation to figure out your initial nitrogen rate, that's what I want you to use. Previous yield history, right, to calculate that yield goal. Whether it's normalized yields over multiple years, want to keep those goals realistic, so no more than probably 10 or 15% increase over the year previous. And where possible, I want to write variable rated yield goals to make sure I'm getting the right amount of nitrogen on the right acre and the right time. If you can get this from your seed company, it's a great piece of information to have. The response to additional nitrogen from a corn hybrid. Not all hybrids react the same to more nitrogen. Some need more nitrogen, or I shouldn't say need more nitrogen. Some can use more nitrogen more efficiently than others. So when you want to think about that, you want to think about what that hybrid is and how it's responded to nitrogen in the past, and how can you use that to your advantage. And then, the rest of the 4 R's, right? Source, timing, and placement. And those really all come down to the source of nitrogen that's most economically viable for you, your previous experience, what you normally do, your power and labor resources, and your equipment and regional limitations. Not all nitrogen sources are available in the same ways in the same places, and not all of them have the same fit for every operation. And then lastly, always thinking about protecting the nitrogen from losses and using those nitrogen stabilizers. Products with NBPT, DCD in them, like for instance, our product Trident. Or if it's an anhydrous application, using a product like to stabilize those anhydrous applications as well. And so you want to think about that in this planning phase and get that plan out on paper and start to implement it in your fields, and really put the most amount of thought on how you get to that right rate number and then move forward from there. So then we make our in-season adjustments, right? And this is where really kind of coming back into that OODA loop, where we observe what's going on, and we're honest with ourselves about what our yield potential is. Is it better than we thought it'd be? Is it what we thought it'd be? Is it not as nice as we think it would be? And we use all these pieces of information to really sort that out, right? And so we can use a lot of different pieces of information. We can use imagery as a way to look at that bigger, and how will that stand looks. How even is our stand? How does it look compared to years previous at the same time? How does the biomass look? Is it bigger? Is it smaller than normal? And those things. Calculating that effective stand percentage, right? Like calculating the actual difference between what your target stand was and the stand that you end up with, minus your doubles, your skips, your runts, all those other things, right? And how does that impact potential yield at the end of the day? And then do an early season plant dig and root assessment, right? Do you have sidewall compaction? Do you have any insect damage? Do you have anything that inhibits that root mass that might inhibit nutrient uptake down the road? Because even though we're talking about nitrogen today, right, that root mass, a small root mass never turns into a big, massive root mass. A relatively big root mass things have to go really wrong for it to be a small root mass later on. So that size of that root mass and that trajectory of that root mass and the trajectory of that plant size really tell us a lot about what the yield potential of that plant can be. Because if you have a big plant with a small root mass at V5, V6, V7, at some point in time that plant's going to struggle to get the appropriate amount of nutrients into it to thrive, to be of maximum efficiency. If you have a smaller plant with a big root mass, that plant might catch up down the road, and we have the ability to take in water and nutrients more efficiently because we're occupying a larger volume of soil with that bigger root mass. Things are going on back to that nitrogen status in the soil, right? Like taking those samples, seeing if we've experienced any loss or any of those things, and using tools like the LSND, the late season nitrogen testing, to decide what to do from a nitrogen application standpoint. The in-season nitrogen status of the plant, NDVI, NDRE, or tissue sampling, or any combination of those things really help us look at that nitrogen status inside the plant. Trusted extended weather forecasts, right? So we know what the conditions are up until this point. What do the conditions look like in the future? And how aggressive do we want to be in this next phase of nitrogen management? And then once again, that use of a nitrogen stabilizer to protect from loss. All these in-season management adjustments can be made multiple times a season, and you can kind of revisit these if you're doing it on a multiple basis. Revisit these every couple weeks to decide where you want to be. And then it's kind of like, so the difference between putting all your nitrogen up front and splitting it up 2 or 3 times is like if we were playing Texas Hold'em poker, right? Me going all in when I see the first card, or me waiting to go all the way in until I see the river card at the end, right? Like waiting till I see all the cards play out before I put my end bet in for that hand. So when we think about making those adjustments, here's just a few things that I use. If I'm using a remote sensing technology, whether it's a drone, a plane, a satellite, sensors mounted to equipment, or a handheld unit in corn, I normally wait until there's sufficient canopy. So V8 at the earliest, V12 is better. I try to include a nitrogen-rich reference zone, and that zone can be as small as 20 by 20 in some cases if you're using the handheld unit. And then I like to calculate what's called the sufficiency index. And that sufficiency index is really the difference between the target area NDRE, which is a combination of the NDVI and the red edge, and the reference area NDRE. And then we can talk about changing that in-season nitrogen rate can be calculated using 1 of 2 algorithms. The Solari algorithm or the Hall and Shepard algorithm, which I can share with people later on. And really what that tells us is that gives us a good idea of what that nitrogen rate should be. And rule of thumb, if your SI is like at 0.95, so you're off by 5%, the first thing you might want to do is add 30 or 40 pounds of nitrogen in that time frame and just watch to see what happens in the next couple weeks. So if you catch it at that V8 range and it's a little on the deficient side, right, give that a little shot and see what happens in the next 2 weeks when you go take that NDRE imagery again and try to just make sure it catches up. That's the best way to kind of manage through this. And then see how conditions change going on from there. You can use this number all the way out to R3. You can use this formula all the way out to R3 to making that last nitrogen deficient decision. Outside of that, the things I use is if my current crop, whenever I'm standing there, if my gut feeling or my personal experience tells me I'm standing in a good to excellent corn crop for the field that I'm in, and my future conditions are favorable, I'm either one, not depending on how aggressive I want to be, I'm not going to change my nitrogen rate at all. I'm going to stay the course, or I'm going to lean into it a little bit and maybe apply just a little bit of extra nitrogen to try to capture close to that maximum yield number. If my current crop is good to excellent and those conditions look unfavorable for the next period of time, I'm either going to stay unchanged, or depending on how confident I am those unfavorable conditions are going to impact yield, I might reduce that nitrogen rate a little bit. If I'm below average and favorable, I might be in the same place. I might not change my nitrogen rate at all. I might reduce it a little bit. If I'm below average or unfavorable, so if I have a poor stand and I have extended drought conditions coming on in a rain-fed situation, I might reduce that application rate of nitrogen, that last rate, just to manage my nitrogen investment and help manage my profitability on that acre. Those are some of the ways I look at this from both a technical standpoint and kind of this good, excellent, what current conditions, what future conditions are, and what my decision tree looks like going forward. So then after we made that final nitrogen application, we're after R3 and there's nothing more we can do from a nitrogen standpoint, we really want to start looking at how that impacts the end of the season. So you want to do things like stock nitrate testing, right, to see how much nitrogen we've left in the stock and how much we've potentially moved to the ear. What our ear to shank attachment looks like. So we want to go shake some plants, look for ears that are dropping, look for ears that aren't attached very well, because that's a sign of some nitrogen deficiency. We want to look at stock quality and standability, right? We want to look at how many of those stalks are going to break, how many harvest issues we might have. We want to dig up some plants, split them open, kind of assess how much cannibalism there is. We want to keep that cannibalism probably to the lower node and half of the plant at most, and look for stock diseases, right? Like, because the earlier cannibalization, and I really don't like that word cannibalization, it's really reallocation. Because we're moving nitrate from the stock to the ear because we ran a little bit short from the soil supply, so the plant pulls it from the ear pulls it from the plant, which is perfectly okay because we want to void that plant of a lot of nitrate anyway to make it to optimize yield. But there's a difference between that starting early and us pulling too much nitrate out of that stock, or starting too late and we leave too much nitrate in the stock. That means we left some yield on the table versus being in the middle and hitting that reallocation portion just about right. And it's kind of like landing an airplane, right? Like, you don't want to be too short of the runway. You don't want to be too long on the runway. There's a sweet spot where you want to hit, and that's different for every field because it's different for every soil type. It's different for every hybrid. but we really want to evaluate where we're at, because if we start cannibalization too early, we might want to look back and in the future say, okay, I might want to push into a little more nitrogen here just to keep that from happening. Or think about the hybrid or population or all those other things. And then break open some ears, the last thing. Observe those ear weights, observe those kernel counts, look at how much you're filling out to the tip, and really look at that kernel depth, right? Like if we're mastering nitrogen management, we're getting really good kernel depth and individual kernel weight. That is the key, that the target we want to hit. So those are some of the pre-harvest evaluation things we want to do to get ready and take notes. Like I like to take notes on the field from start to finish. So at the end of the year, I can look back at my notes and I can start to think about what I'm going to do different. So the last decision piece we want to talk about is that post-harvest valuation, right? So we want to look at things like yield, of course, right? Like that's the number, and use your yield monitor. And our target is you need to be near your yield goal or higher, right? We don't want to fall way short of our yield goals, especially when we're talking about nitrogen management. Then we can get in some deeper metrics, and this is where kind of understanding where that line between maximum yield and the start of your diminishing returns are. So we want to calculate partial factor productivity. And really that's your yield in pounds per acre divided by your pounds of fertilizer per acre. Ideally, we want that number to be somewhere between 60 and 80. The higher the number, the better we've done. But if we get over 80, then we're getting to a point where we're leaving some yield on the table. The other way we can do this is really calculate our partial nutrition balance, right? And so that is the pounds of nitrogen removed in the grain. And so there's a couple ways you can do this. You can just use a standard removal rate, or so you can use 0.67, or you can actually take grain samples, send them into a lab, and have them estimate how much nitrogen is in your grain for a particular hybrid in a particular field, and then divide it by the pounds of nitrogen applied. And that number should fall somewhere between 0.92 and 1.01 to be kind of our maximum efficiency. If it's too much over 1, we are leaving nitrogen out in the field to be lost. If it's too much under 0.9, what we're going to find is we're leaving some yield on the table. So somewhere between that 0.92 and 1.01 is where we want to be. Then we want to calculate your cost per bushel. And then, of course, what percentage of your nitrogen cost is, what percentage of gross profit is your nitrogen cost. And those two numbers I didn't put a target in because those are things that you and your operation need to understand how you want to use that number. I think it's just a great number for me to always reference to. The first two numbers that we calculate don't have any economic factor in it. They're just purely agronomic. The second two are economic. And I think there's some combination of understanding what the relative conditions between those two are that are for you to understand where you are optimizing your nitrogen investment for your operation, regardless of commodity and nitrogen price, right? And so then when I do all that, I take all the notes from the planning session up until here, I evaluate the decisions I made, and then I include things like, how did using a fungicide impact this? How did using PGRs or any other thing I did that could impact yield, plant population, and continually refine that system to improve my nitrogen use efficiency. Because if I can do that, right, like I know that I'm doing what's best for my operation from an economic standpoint. I'm doing what's best for my community and my neighborhood and everything else from an environmental standpoint. And I know that I don't have to make big changes all the time. That it's just these little nuances that make a difference. And the other thing is, the more I do this, the the more I know that there's a lot I still have to learn about nitrogen management, and there's a lot of gray area that's fun to explore and fun to play with to understand what's going on, and hopefully give us a better understanding. Like the role mineralization plays, especially as we talk about increasing organic matters because of cover crops, or the role cover crops are going to play for nitrogen recapture and maybe release later on, are really going to change the game when we think about traditional nitrogen management. So understanding those things and trying to learn by yourself, or with the help of your agronomist, but learn on your operation how those things impact or interact, are critically important to success. So in conclusion, right, like I said, there's no single answer to the what is the best system question. The best system is the one that works best for you and your operation. Not just from an efficiency standpoint when we talk about nitrogen calculations, but from a division of labor, power, monetary resources, and all those things. It's got to check all the boxes for it to be the right system for you. Small changes make a big impact. Nitrogen placement, nitrogen timing make a huge impact. There are things that we don't need to really think about but we need to understand how we're going to get those done. And that there's no absolute right rate for nitrogen. There's only staying within an acceptable range of the optimum rate. If we went to the same spot in the same field year after year after year, the optimum rate of that nitrogen would not be the same 2 years in a row, and probably wouldn't be the same 2 years out of 10. So we really need to just kind of stay in the range of what that right number is, higher or lower from an acceptable standpoint for you and your operation. And so I just want to thank everybody for their time this morning. I hope people got something out of this, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Mike. That was really interesting. And it's great to hear all of your information about keeping flexible with nitrogen. And, I've definitely had the idea that, it does change week to week. And so, yeah, it's very interesting. Anyways, we do have a few questions that came in from our attendees. I think I want to start with this one from Daryl, just because it was applicable to what you were just talking about. And he's asking, how much nitrogen does the soil typically supply? And that might be hard to answer, but let's hear what you have to say.
So, Daryl, it's highly dependent on where you live. And for a lot of the reasons there's so many factors that play into it. Your organic matter, and really kind of the difference between like active organic matter and just your all total organic matter. The things that are going to contribute to it the most are temperature and moisture. So in a normal growing season, so if you have adequate moisture and temperature stays pretty steady, you're going to have a lot of mineralization. And so I'll use 2012 in Nebraska as an example. 2012 was the drought year, right? So like dryland, non-irrigated corn, it didn't matter because it didn't rain. But on irrigated corn, if you could keep up with the moisture, if you keep up with the water, we had monstrous yields without really applying any more nitrogen. And the reason for that was we were mineralizing so much nitrogen in that season because of the moisture and the soil temperatures. The soil just fed a lot of extra bushels on top of the sunlight and everything else. You go to a couple years later, where we had cloudier conditions in June and July and August, yields were down a little bit on the same amount of nitrogen, mostly because we weren't getting the sun units, but we also weren't getting that when that soil's cooler. We weren't getting that additional nitrogen out of the soil either. So I think it really comes down to where you live, and our best estimates are probably still off by 30 or 50 pounds of nitrogen an acre. In general. So I know that's a horrible answer to a tough question, but it's got so many factors in it. I can't say. I will tell you that a percent of organic matter will mineralize somewhere between 50 and probably 100 pounds per acre. Now,
did you say 15 to 100?
50 to 100. Now, that's a wide range, right? And so it can be anywhere in the middle of that. And then if you have 2 or 3% organic matter, there could be there. And so that's the thing is, we need to count on some of it, but we can't count on all of it. So we need to that's why playing that out, that last nitrogen application out as long as we can, really helps us figure out where we need to be on the application side.
Yeah, so you're really sort of starting with that organic matter fraction, and then the environment kind of factors into it after that.
Yeah. And a lot of our algorithms take the organic matter into impact at the beginning. Okay. So, I mean, I think if you just look at it that way, and then in season kind of give yourself, do you think it's going to be a high mineralization year? And some of the models do a really good idea of giving us trend, right? Is it going to be higher or lower? And so we don't necessarily need an exact number. We just kind of need to know, is it going to be good, bad, or average, right?
Okay. All right, we'll go on to the next one. Mark is asking, should we think of nitrogen application alone, or do we tie it with sulfur?
Always with sulfur.
Okay.
And how aggressive you want to be with that is up to you. Like, I'm pretty aggressive in nitrogen and sulfur. They are critical that they get used together in the plant. I probably apply a little more sulfur than most people, but I'm always, nitrogen and sulfur always need to be paired together.
Okay, so at every application?
It almost can't be done in every application because anhydrous it's really hard. But yeah, liquid and dry, yes, I'm always using some blend of sulfur and nitrogen.
Okay. Lowell King has a question. Hi, Lowell. Lowell was one of our Responsible Nutrient Management Practitioner Award winners not too long ago. Anyways, Lowell says, I've read that N stabilizers are very hard on soil biological activity. Can you address that trade-off?
So we've given nitrogen stabilizers a bad rap in parts of that, yes, they do impact a portion of the biological community, right? Like in general, we're targeting the nitrifying population of the biological community. But we're not. What we have to remember is biological communities, especially when we're talking about bacteria, their ability to repopulate under normal conditions is pretty remarkable. So, and we're not asking to do it. So, we're not looking to eliminate a biological community or lessen the activity of a particular biological community for the whole growing season. What we're looking to do is to give the nitrogen a chance to go through its normal transition of oxidation. So what we want it to be is in the ammonium form and to latch on to a soil particle. And so we're looking at DCD probably only really impacts the biological community for maybe 2 or 3 weeks at the most. And it's a pretty linear, like it's not a straight line that it's the same impact the whole time, right? Like there comes a point where that falls off. Same with nitropirin, right? Like it's sudden, and then as conditions warrant, that population repopulates around it, and we're just buying a little time. So yes, it's momentarily has an impact on that biological community level, but it doesn't impact it forever. And so like and I think what we need to understand is the soil is more resilient than we give it credit for in 90% of the cases of what we're talking about. Whether it's tillage, nitrogen stabilizers, anything, right? Like anything that changes the pH of the soil, anything that changes the soil structure momentarily has an impact on that biological population, but that resiliency of that population will fix that problem and achieve balance faster than we give it credit for.
Okay. And so when you say that the populations come back, do they come back to the level that they were at?
Yeah, they'll come back to near that same level of population. You don't really kind of redistribute that population very much at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking it's about not nitrogen or stabilizers, but there were some studies done in Australia that showed like a application of, I think it was glyphosate, and it did impact the microbial community, but it came back. But then when you did another application, it impacted it a little more, and they came back, and then you did another application, it impacted it a little more. So I guess it might depend a little bit on how many applications there are.
Right.
That sort of thing.
And using the right rate of it, like using the right rate of a nitrogen stabilizer is key to that too, right? Like the rate's there for a reason. So you don't need more of it necessarily to get more activity. You just need what you need to get the impact on yield and nitrogen efficiency you want. More doesn't necessarily get you better results.
Right. Okay. We have a couple of follow-up questions about stabilizers. Treg Owings says, what is your feeling on N stabilizers? We're having a debate on if they work on darker soils in our area of the Palouse.
So the higher your organic matter, the darker your soil is. There's this balance between that soil has a greater capacity to create the functions of nitrogen loss than a lower organic matter soil, but also has a capacity to mineralize more nitrogen than a lower organic matter soil. So it's kind of like this balance of can you take out that insurance policy to make sure you're utilizing the nitrogen you apply the most effectively. And so one of the things Trey, what I like to tell is you need to, sometimes you gotta separate does it do what we ask it to do in most all situations from a biological or a functional standpoint? And I would say yes. Does that always show up in yield? Not necessarily, but like neither does crop insurance, right? Like you take it out every year, and not every year do you have to claim on it. And so I think finding that balance of what's right for you, and I think finding the right nitrogen stabilizer for you, Trey, is probably more important than just using a random one off the shelf. And so like that's a deeper conversation to have. And so like, and I have some ways to talk about that, but like, I know they work differently across all soil conditions, but I can tell you from testing them in a wide range of soil conditions, we see them working in all of those. Now, do they work to the exact same bushel number? No, but they do work.
Okay, good. We have one more question about nitrogen inhibitors. Francisco Burgos says, thanks for the talk. Using a nitrogen inhibitor, how much can we reduce the dose of total nitrogen required by the plant?
So now we get back into that. What's the right number, right? And I would say you pick up. We pick up around 5 to 10% efficiency using a nitrogen stabilizer. Now, I can look at that two ways. I can reduce the amount of nitrogen I apply by 5 or 10% and yield the same as if I didn't use the stabilizer at all. Or I can maintain my nitrogen number and gain 5 or 10% in yield. I'm of the mindset that I'm going to utilize that efficiency to capture more yield instead of pulling back and ending up where I'm at. Now, that's just me. If you, from an economic standpoint, if you feel like you need to pull back on that nitrogen number a little bit because of nitrogen prices, then like I would stay somewhere in between that 5 to 10% number and go from there.
Okay, great. We have some questions about testing, but before we get to those, I just want to circle back. Daryl had a follow-up to the question about sulfur. He says, what ratio of nitrogen to sulfur?
So Daryl, that's going to vary a little bit about where you're at in your soil organic matters because that's where your soil sulfur is going to be. I mean, I've run aggressive as a, for every 5 pounds of nitrogen, a pound of sulfur. I've run 15 pounds of nitrogen to a pound of sulfur. Most of the time I'm somewhere in that 10 to 12 pounds of nitrogen and then a pound of sulfur, just kind of depending on the conditions of the field. And that's also something that I've kind of learned and experienced working with the field. Like some fields are more willing to give up sulfur than others, even at higher organic matters, because of their clay contents. So I just kind of continually kind of play with that number to see what's right and what's been working the best.
Okay, great. And then before we get to the testing, there's a question here about cover crops. Is there clear data between planting cover crops contributing to pre-planting season nitrogen levels in the soil? That's from Larry Spicard.
Larry, as soon as I find the cover crop phenomenon is so new that I definitely think it has agronomic value. Don't get me wrong. It's trying to understand in every situation what that value is a little tricky because there's so many things that go into that that number. And I know it sounds like I'm not answering very many of these questions directly, right? But like stand establishment has a huge and then did you graze it? Did you bale it off? How did you terminate it? All these things play into how much nitrogen it's going to bring back to the next crop. Like I don't know if we've really explored all the options yet to figure that out. So I would just keep looking, Larry, and at the very least, try things on your own farm. Like I am a true believer that to dedicate like 10 to 20% of your operation to exploring new technologies and new methods. Take that, 10% is probably the right number. 10% of your operation, using it to explore new technologies and new operations for the benefit of your operation and your experience. So that would be the best way for me to tell you to go find the best data for that is to go create your own.
Yeah, that is really good advice. And I know Rick Clark has done a lot of studies on his own farm in terms of nutrient release from cover crops. But of course, it's going to be relevant to his farm. So anyways, really interesting stuff. We have a couple of questions about testing. Chuck White asks, are late spring nitrate tests reliable for estimating nitrogen in the soil?
They are a good place to start, right? Like I don't know if once again, right, like it's there's so much there. You can get into the discussion about spatial variability. We can get in the discussion about temporal variability of nitrates in the soil, but it's a good baseline, right? I think if you pair that with a sample later in the year, and I'm gonna reference this as like from the exact same spot. When I talk about sampling from nitrates, I like to georeference my sample points and sample from the same spots all year long. Because now I've kind of reduced that spatial variability, and I'm only looking at the temporal variability of the nitrogen in the soil. And so I would say there's accurate as any other given time in the year. They're just a snapshot of what's going on in the soil, right? And that's that dynamic nature of nitrogen, right? Like it's not going to be the same it's not going to be the same all season long. And so, like, I think it's a good place to start.
Okay. Sounds good. We have an anonymous attendee who asks, where are the most common places to get an LSNT test done during the season?
So it's just a basic. So the LSNT, it's just a basic nitrate test. So you can get it done at any soils lab. If you go on the web and you search for the LSND, then it'll kind of give you the formula or the calculation to use to how to take that number and convert it to a nitrogen rate. So, and basically it talks about being sufficient nitrogen or being a little bit subpar, and how do you make up the difference. So you can go, any lab will get you the right number, right? Any certified soils lab will get you the right number. Then it's just a matter of going out and looking for that equation and using it to get to the right rate.
Okay, great. Brooks Bren wants to know, which platform or service do you trust for accurate extended weather forecasts?
Being in Nebraska, I trust the climatologists at the University of Nebraska as much as anybody when it comes to looking at long-term forecasts. Now, I only look probably 30 days at a time, right? Because nobody really knows past that, right? Like the farther we look, the murkier the water is. So I only kind of pay attention to the next 30 days, and then like I said, in my gut, do I believe it? And I'll say this. I've said this, I don't know how many times in the last 12 years. I believe nitrogen management is as much art as it is science. It's as much you knowing your situation. And that's why I can't, all of you on this call, I can't make nitrogen recommendations from you for here. Because I don't know your exact situations. I don't have that experience with you. So nobody's better at it than the people closest to you.
Great. We have a couple more questions about stabilizers. How does ATS compare in nitrogen stabilization versus other N stabilizers?
So really, it does create some pH disruptions around the nitrogen that do kind of slow down some biological reactions. The biggest benefit we get from ATS with a nitrogen application is that relationship between nitrogen and sulfur being together when the plant wants to take it up. Because of how both of them are, if you look at the functions of nitrogen and sulfur in from a plant physiological standpoint, they're paralleled in every way. So if you need nitrogen, you need sulfur. And you need to make amino acids, proteins. You need it to do all these things for chlorophyll, for photosynthesis. And so, it's really about that dynamic of them being together is really more important than what it does for nitrogen stabilization. Now, that being said, like I said, it does have some impact there, but the big benefit you see is from the pairing of those two things together.
And then Doug Honeck wants to know, does the carbon level have an influence on the amount of nitrogen stabilizer needed? Also, would you supply the meaning of the acronyms used in your presentation?
So yes, I think it does make a difference, Doug. I can't quantify what that difference is today. I'm working on it. And yes, we can apply those acronyms to those things.
Yeah. By the way, he's asking for a copy of the presentation for the future. And just so everybody knows, we are going to put this presentation up on our website later today, so it will be available for reviewing. Okay, and let's see, is inhibitor use mainly for larger nitrogen applications, or would you use it with on-seed or 2x2 starters?
Mostly for your so my rule of thumb, if you're only using nitrogen stabilizer in one application, if you apply in multiple windows, but you're only going to use it in one, use it in the largest percentage of your nitrogen farthest away from crop use first. And then if you use it a second time, use it in the second largest group. For me, and starter fertilizers, one, there's not a lot of nitrogen. If you're just using like a 10-34-0, 6-24-6, 7-24-3, there's not much nitrogen there. It's going to get taken up pretty quick by the plant, like hopefully in the first 21 days. So like I'm not terribly worried about that compared to 120 pounds or 110 pounds as a weed and feed application in that same timing right on top of the soil. If I get to choose which one of those two I'm going to protect, I'm going to protect that weed and feed application over the 2x2 or a starter fertilizer application on seed. So thank you.
That makes sense. Mike Steinke wants to know, does the nitrogen source influence your assessments? To the best of my knowledge, the most common source in the U.S. is urea. Does it influence the stabilizer levels?
I believe that all sources of nitrogen in a given point in the growing season need a level of protection based on their individual. Like urea has a lot different risk profile for loss than say UAN, which has a lot different profile for loss than anhydrous ammonia. Understanding what your risk for loss is with each source and each timing of application really helps you pick the right stabilizer to match source and timing more than just source alone. And I truly believe like there's a right tool for every problem that we have with nitrogen. It's about getting down to can you source that? Can you get that available to you? Is it economically viable to you? All those things are a great discussion between you and your agronomist. But yes, I think urea needs stabilizers. I think that need is a little different than UAN and anhydrous, but it does need a stabilizer.
How do you rank those three in terms of which one has the most risk?
They're equal.
They're equal?
So it's the mechanism of loss is different, right? And so what comes like our biggest risk for loss in urea a lot of the time is volatilization. So losing it to the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. After that, then they all kind of have this equal amount of risk for leaching and denitrification. Other than normally anhydrous is put on, like if we're talking about fall anhydrous applications, it has the biggest time window of risk. And so like that makes it like, so when I say it's all equal, right? Like that's taking in timing, placement, and everything that they all have, I think, the same relative amount of risk. It's which loss mechanism are we talking about and how can we influence that from happening?
Okay, excellent. Great. Well, Mike, this timed out perfectly. We're done with the questions and it is just about 11 o'clock. So thank you so much for joining us. That was very informative. Just want to give everybody a little heads up before you log off. We will be sending you a questionnaire to complete, and we'd love it if you'd complete it and send it back so we can, for future planning of webinars. And as I mentioned before, we will be making a replay of today's webinar available in the event that you want to go back and watch it again. And somebody did ask if we would have a full text available, and I think we can do that. So it won't go up at the same exact time. We just have to get the transcription done, but we'll take care of that as well. So that'll be up later on. And so this will be up on our No-Till Farmer website later on today, the recorded version of this. It will include all of the questions and answers. And like I said, we'll get the full text up later on. And Mike, maybe if you want to send me your presentation, we can also post that on there so people can go back and look at the slides.
I can sure do that.
Okay, great. So once again, I want to thank everybody for coming. Mike, thank you so much for leading the discussion about improving nitrogen efficiency, and thank you to Verdesian for sponsoring the webinar. I hope everybody got some good ideas for managing this critical input in the coming season. And thanks, of course, to all of you for joining us today, and hope you have a great day. So goodbye, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, and have a safe spring, everybody.